Hi there, I'm Logan Medish, your host, and today's guest on the show has what I think is the coolest job title in the museum world. Hope you enjoy. My guest today on the show is Jonathan Ferguson. He is the Keeper of Firearms and Artillery at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. His research interests include the use and effect of firearms and their depiction in popular culture. He has co-curated the Make Believe exhibit in 2019 and is curating the forthcoming Firefight Second World War display at the Leeds Museum. His publications include the book Mauser Broomhandle Pistol in 2017 and a contribution to The Right to Bear Arms, Historical Perspectives, and the Debate on the Second Amendment in 2018. He's also the author of the forthcoming book Thornycroft to SA-80, British Bullpup Firearms, 1901 to 2020. And he's also a bit of a TV star, having made several media appearances, including on the History Channel's Sean Bean on Waterloo and Channel 5's Inside the Tower of London. With that remarkable resume out of the way, Jonathan, welcome to High Caliber History.
Hi, Logan. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. The honor is all mine. It's a pleasure to have you. Appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. Now, the first thing I want to address, in a previous professional life of mine, I had the job title of Firearms Specialist, which I thought was a pretty darn cool job title. And a lot of other people seem to think so too. I would actually have people ask me for a business card just because it said Firearms Specialist on it, which was pretty neat. And I really did believe that it was probably the coolest job title out there in the firearms industry. That is until I met you. Your job title, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, is Keeper of Arms and Artillery, which is hands down the coolest job title of all time.
Thank you. Yeah, it's far more metal than I deserve.
What exactly does the Keeper of Arms and Artillery do?
It's not a funny story, but there is a story behind the Keeper title, because when I started at the Royal Armouries a decade ago now, that system had gone away. So at one time we were part of the civil service working for the government, and you had a whole hierarchy, almost like ranks, from curatorial assistant up through assistant curator, senior curator, principal curator. And then you had keeper, and this was across the National Museum. So the British Museum, which still operates part of the system, I believe. The National Museums of Scotland also do. But there, a keeper is the head of a whole department. So, a dozen plus people, lots of management responsibility. In 2016, we had a restructure and they decided to merge some of the disciplines at effectively a department level, but we're a lot smaller scale than, say, the British Museum would be. So I'm a keeper, but I'm in charge of 5 people, curators and an assistant curator. So really what you probably call a team almost anywhere else is we are calling a department. But you know what? I'm quite happy with that because I still want to be a curator. So I don't want to be management guy, never getting to do the stuff. So it suits me. And as you say, it does sound cool as well.
It does. It sounds very cool. When I had my former title, people would say, well, what does a firearms specialist do? And I would jokingly tell them, I said, I'm basically a curator, but they won't call me that so that they can pay me less.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have the opposite situation. They're throwing or promoting me effectively, but me being me, I was quite happy being a curator, just doing what I did. So, yeah, I actually resisted it at first, but to be quite honest, it's a really nice mixture of having a little bit of influence, because a curator in a modern museum doesn't necessarily have any influence, and still getting to do research, exhibitions, still doing some inquiries, as you know. You and I have spoken about a couple. So I do everything a curator does, but I also have a management role and a sort of supposedly a strategic role as well. But there are a lot of cooks involved in that particular stew.
Gotcha. Now, I also know that before you came to the Royal Armouries, you worked at a couple other museums that also had some firearms and artillery pieces in them. And I'm curious to know, which came first? Was it your interest in museums or was it your interest in firearms? or did they kind of arise as a joint thing?
I think I can legitimately say it was the firearms. Primarily because my dad had an interest. I mean, he hadn't pursued it beyond, this being the UK, he hadn't pursued it beyond sort of air guns and military history and, dabbling. He hadn't got into target shooting or anything like that. So it was very much from an historical perspective that I picked up that interest, among others, military aircraft, armored vehicles, all the stuff that young boys like. Yeah. So, more general interest in history and archaeology followed within probably a few years. And I guess after a few years, I kind of gave up before I even started on getting any kind of job related to firearms. So I went down a slightly parallel career path, never dreaming that I would end up at any of the places that I ended up, least of all doing what I'm doing.
Okay. Now, you mentioned you had kind of given up on having anything to do with firearms, and was that more early on, or was that because, given the laws and things over there, that you just found it more difficult to do?
Yeah, it's an interesting case study in a way, I suppose. I mean, we're talking here about very, very young. I was flicking through my dad's military history and firearm books when I was like 6 or 7 or something. So at that point, career was, not in my mind. By the time it was, I'd kind of gone down the archaeology, paleontology, geology parallel interest because it seemed like, although that seemed hopeless as well. At least there were jobs potentially, one day maybe. So really, it was to do with shooting and collecting an enthusiast scene that does exist in the country, but knowing no one that was involved other than my grandfather, who actually had a really nice collection, primarily of black powder, muzzle loading arms. But at that age, I had no concept of what he had, and I don't know that I wasn't allowed in there, but I certainly wasn't invited in there. And sadly, by the time I was really old enough to take an interest, he died. So that opportunity kind of went by the by. The only way I potentially would have gotten into, I guess, shooting sports. There's, as you know, plenty of people who study the history and even the contemporary side of firearms without ever getting into the sporting side, target or hunting. But the possibility is definitely here on the hunting side. Even more so, my grandfather was quite had some money, and he enjoyed his rough shooting, rabbits and things like that, and clays and birds as well, I believe. So, but the problem was I didn't really have an interest down that avenue. For me, it was more about people and guns and the history of it and that side. So didn't seem like there was much of a path. And then I thought, well, I'm going to get into this stuff when I get older, one way or another, sure. But it won't be my career, won't be my vocation. But it ended up being that, which is great.
Yeah, you mentioned getting into it through your grandfather, and I think that's a common thing for a lot of people. My grandfather was and still is my biggest gun buddy, if you will. And, growing up, he was the one who introduced me to firearms. And it was really great because he had a lot of different stuff in the safe, and he was a 3-gun competition shooter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was. It was really cool. And he had a lot of stuff in the safe, and, I was welcome to check it all out. Under his safe observation, of course, but the big catch was that if I wanted to check it out, I had to clean it, which was a great way to get to know all of the guns. But looking back on it now, 20 some years later, in addition to a good way to get to know the guns, it was also a really good way for him to get someone else to clean the guns without having to do it. And if you can ever have the opportunity to have someone else clean the guns, that's a good opportunity to take.
Yeah, I regret missing out because I didn't really connect with him. I missed that opportunity, and that was partly the distance, I guess, but also, as I say, that's not quite where my interests lie. I mean, I think he had stuff that I would have found fascinating, and sadly we didn't get to connect before he passed away. So it's sad, but I think I can look back and realize that we had that shared interest, and he did give me in his will. I was meant to be one, but due to lack of family interest elsewhere, I inherited 3 little percussion, like vest pocket or handbag pistols, which the intent was that myself and my 2 cousins might start our own collections, which is really cool. But unfortunately, once you're spoiled by the Royal Armouries collection, there's really not that much you want to buy.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I've spent some time around some amazing firearm collections in museums and with private collectors, and you almost get jaded by seeing some of the most remarkable, rare, collectible pieces. And it gets to a point where, anything you would come across at the local gun show no longer really has the appeal that it could, would, or should, given to being spoiled by the other stuff.
And the stuff you might want for yourself on a curator's salary, you probably aren't getting that.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is all too true. I think pretty much any museum professional will tell you that they got into it for the love of being in a museum, not because they thought they were ever going to get rich doing it. So now you had mentioned that you were interested in firearms when you were younger, but then didn't think it was really going to be much of a career choice, and thankfully it changed and it has become a wonderful career for you. But I'm curious to know, what was a misconception that you had about the field that you found to be totally untrue once you got into it? It was wow, I was not expecting that at all. I was totally wrong. Whether it be a positive or a negative, what was a misconception?
Well, I guess by the time I'd kind of come full circle and done my museum training and done archaeology and thought I'd probably end up curating teapots or something. And seriously, I could have done pivoting back around to one of my kind of core interests, and guns were right up there. Obviously, I had the thought that, the profession is quite museums are politicized, as you know, and my perception was perhaps that firearms are deprecated, and that's partly why I suspected there wouldn't be a job. When I was at Edinburgh Castle, I was trying to specialize in edge weapons because I'm also interested in edge weapons, but also because I thought, firstly, there aren't many posts, and it's kind of dead man's shoes and a lot of luck in all of these areas. But also I thought, the politics of firearms in Europe and the UK specifically are such that the opportunities to do anything with this stuff are going to be surely very limited. But as it turns out, there are plenty of people, but it's more diverse a political spectrum than perhaps people realize from outside. And more than anything else, the museums have this, I like to think, you can't be truly neutral, of course, but we seem to try and mostly succeed to have an objective position on things, as the classic argument goes on the legal status of firearms, of, guns killing people versus people killing people, that kind of thing. For the most part, people in museums and museum visitors don't, in my experience anyway, and the more I've done this, the more I'm kind of affirmed in that. They don't see the thing in the case and put evil on it. They don't necessarily make that value judgment, or if they do, and some do, then a museum is a safe, to use the much abused phrase, a safe space, literally a safe space for to see the stuff, to maybe even to handle it, to see it used, to sort of think about it. And if you are anti, or you just haven't thought about it, which I suspect is by far the biggest factor in the UK. I don't know that people are necessarily. This is what I'm getting at, is then that it's not the thing itself. It's not the firearm that most people have that gut reaction against. Now, that doesn't mean to say we don't try to consider and cater for people that might have that. We certainly have no remit to try and win people round on that score. And might even be difficult for us to do, even if we did. But we're a sort of neutral ground, I guess. So people who already love guns will come to the museum and look for the guns, and we cater for them. People who probably are against them in principle, or at least the ownership of them, I'm sure they come and take something away as well. I mean, we are very, when you and I have had these discussions, as have others at things like the Cody Firearms Symposium, where we wrestle with these thorny issues. And I'm not trying to minimize any of that, but certainly, but my preconception, and those of people I speak to, especially in the US, is that museums in the UK and the British public are not going to be interested, or they're going to be outright against. And I don't think that's the case. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
No, well, it's a very nuanced subject, and yeah, I think it actually, well, it really plays well into the next thing I want to talk about, which is a misconception that I had um, pertaining to firearms and firearms laws and museums. I had just assumed that the firearms laws in England would be incredibly restrictive as it pertains to museums, given to the way the laws are for people. It wasn't until I met you and we were at the Cody Firearms Museum together at the Arsenals of History Symposium that I learned that there's such a thing as a museum firearms license over there, which actually it makes things a lot easier for a museum to take possession of a firearm than it is here in the States. If it's not a government-run entity over here, then you have to have all of the same firearms licenses that you would have if you were a regular firearms dealer, which can be kind of off-putting to a museum over here. So I thought that was very interesting, and that it's totally different and actually better in that regard over there.
Yeah, and just to add to your summary there of the US situation, what struck me the most, having those discussions and presentations from other people, was if let's sort of compare, because this has happened many times, if a prohibited weapon, an assault, I use the phrase advisedly, assault rifle, comes up, that let's say it's at the bottom of somebody's boating pond, I don't know.
Yeah, it happens a lot. There's a lot of boating accidents here in the States.
Oh, I gather. If that was in the UK, and let's say it was nicely packed in grease or something and wasn't just rust, then we could instantly take possession of that, and then it would just be down to our own, essentially, bureaucracy to document and account for that. Well, I say that under the museum firearms license that you've mentioned, effectively our collections database, our catalogue, is our register, if you like, equivalent of our firearms certificate or register if we were a dealer, which we also are, by the way. So we would be able to just take possession of that, rescue it, and go on from there. And as I understand it, in the States, that would have to be turned over to the federal authorities. Not got that wrong.
Yeah, generally speaking, it's federal authorities, and with machine guns, and I fielded a lot of phone calls when I worked at the National Firearms Museum. Someone would call up and say, I've got granddad's, you name it, machine gun, is M3 grease gun that he brought back from World War II, and it was in his footlocker in the attic, and we want to donate it to the museum. What's our next step? And my first question would be, is it papered? Is it registered? Do you have the tax stamp and everything with it? And sometimes they'd be like, yeah, he kept really good paperwork and we've got it. And if that's the case, then the museum can take possession of that. And it's all okay. But unfortunately, more often than not, the conversation when asking about registration, it's, well, what's that? And then that's when things go a little bit sideways, because I tell them, well, then, we didn't have this conversation and you don't have that gun, because what I like to call them is, unconvicted felons. And it was a shame because, even though the National Firearms Museum has all of the applicable federal licenses, they couldn't take possession of one of these unregistered firearms because it is a privately run museum. It is not run by a government entity of any kind, state, local, or federal. And that's just one of the really weird things about it is that, if the museum had been federally run, like say for instance the Smithsonian Institution, then they could take that gun, not a problem. And the same thing goes for like the Springfield Armory National Historic Site run by the National Park Service in Springfield, Massachusetts. That's a federal entity, so they could have taken it. Or even a state-run facility like the J.M. Davis Museum in Claremore, Oklahoma. And that reveals a situation, where the laws and regulations around it are kind of arbitrary. If you've got local, state, or federal government involved, you're good to go. But if it's private run, even if you have the licenses, then you're out of luck. And it's really kind of arbitrary. But I think as you and I have both found, laws, regardless of which side of the pond you're on, are a little bit arbitrary, no matter what, when it comes to firearms and museums.
Sure. Yeah. So on the face of it, the situation for us isn't much different. We're equivalent to, well, in a narrow way, we're equivalent to something like the Smithsonian. We are a nationally funded, capital N National Museum. So you'd expect us to have a similar level of authority as, say, the Smithsonian or, a national museum, government-funded museum in the States. But the interesting thing about the museum firearms license is, yes, that applies to us and makes life relatively a lot easier for us than it is for any private citizen or organization. But it isn't just for national museums. Far from it. Any museum, any accredited museum under the Museums Association accreditation scheme can apply for a museum firearms license from the government Home Office. And of course, it's completely discretionary in theory, just like all licensing in the UK. The government can tell you no, but they generally don't. And if it's a valid, if it's an actual museum open to the public, you get your bit of paper and you can do everything that we can do within a museum context. Now, obviously, that is open to some interpretation, but for us, that includes, anything you might imagine that goes on in a museum. Interpretation-wise, we're able to shoot some of the collection as well. So yeah, so it's not quite carte blanche, but it's compared to, and of course the big difference is, the museums in the US have depending on their constitution, as it were, have it harder than museums in the UK do. On the civilian ownership side, it's obviously very different. And if you kind of think about it and look at the history of how our two countries developed, it makes perfect sense. The US is all about individual rights to such things enshrined in law. The UK, it is argued back and forth, but essentially we don't. and because we don't, because the government has maintained those rights for themselves. So of course the national museums and those museums that are given due permission to do so get to keep all the guns. It's a different approach. I'm not going to say which is better, but it does. The one is a consequence of the other. Our environment is relatively restrictive and always has been. So most of the guns end up in government control. Yours has been permissive, therefore a lot of guns end up in civilian control, meaning that there's no special dispensation for museums. It makes sense in that way.
Yeah, you're right. And that's where it becomes a situation of, is it really better in the UK than it is in the US? And it's one of those, well, short answer, yes, with an if, long answer, no, with a but. And, speaking purely as an American, I'd rather have it this way over here than that way over there. And, but at the same time, it's a shame. I hate seeing pieces of firearms history and military history being destroyed due to the idiosyncrasies of the law, and it becomes a problem with the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. They've only got so much storage space. They don't need 300 M3 grease guns. And so it does become a bit of a conundrum. But then on the flip side to that, I as a private firearms owner, I do enjoy being able to purchase a firearm with relative ease within all of the constraints, the legal constraints of the law, being able to have that private ownership. But again, it's a toss up, and I have friends and coworkers who fall on both sides of the spectrum with that. And I don't think in terms of the museum aspect of it, I don't necessarily know that one is better than the other. It's just that they are decidedly different. With your position working in the museum, I want to talk a little bit more about something that you'd mentioned, talk about firing some of the guns in the collection. And you guys have a relatively unique collection in terms of firearms museums and the way they're set up. And you've had the opportunity, I'm sure, to shoot some of the most remarkable pieces of history. And I'm curious to know what are some of the really unique things that you've shot? What have you enjoyed shooting most? And how does it work over there with you having access to these firearms and being able to shoot them in a professional and museum related application?
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole job is a massive privilege, and to be able to occasionally, with good reason, get involved in shooting anything, frankly, is great. I jump at the chance whenever it comes up, whether it's someone inviting me to a guest day, shooting things that individuals can own, or whether it's doing research or filming a documentary and firing something on the job, as it were. I mean, you cannot. I never for one moment take any of that for granted. Every day I walk in, I thank my lucky stars just for being there, never mind for being able to do that. But that said, yeah, and it's a weird situation because it means that myself and a few other people with usually access through their employment, or they are military or affiliated. There are relatively few people in the UK with that privileged position that they occasionally get to shoot things that, as you say, most people in the UK don't get the opportunity to shoot. Even things that most people in the States don't get to shoot. A weird thing. I kind of rocket straight through the barrier of what's legal in the UK to what's unobtainium almost anywhere else. And we. Needless to say, anything that we do shoot that's super rare, it's because we have more than one of them. We have carefully assessed them. There is a very good reason to do so, and so that's rare. Don't get me wrong, but it does mean that. So for the thing that pops into my mind was so we're working on something related to it's a very small display for our Second World War offer, as it were. It's a corner of the upstairs of our war gallery, but hopefully it punches above its weight. And in researching for that, I looked into and actually didn't end up featuring, but in terms of informing the research around the STG, the Sturmgewehr, I did actually get to shoot an MKB 42H. Which having fired a Sturmgewehr 44 was, it's going to sound very obvious, but was oddly different. So, there's like it's open bolt, so there's a bit of a Sten gun style ka-chunk going on, but because of the big return spring, it's almost like half Sten gun, half AR-15. Or like, that's the only way you can really fully get to grips. You can do almost everything from the desk, from the collection statically, but in terms of there is an added value to being able to shoot something for yourself. Now, obviously, if it's only like 10 rounds or whatever it was that I was able to put through that, then that's limited. still great. For the Mauser broom handle book, which was a relatively accessible kind of introduction to the type. I will never be a true specialist in the C96, but I thought I will not be able to, especially because I can't do it in my own private sphere, as it were. I thought I've got to take advantage of the ability to shoot some broom handle pistols. So we prepared a few that we're not going to sort of suffer from the process, and I put about 200 rounds through different types. And so for someone in my position, otherwise that's a perspective you're just not going to get unless you go and spend a week in a foreign country where you can do such a thing, including the Schnellfeuer. So, I'm sure there are plenty of people in the US who have fired a Schnellfeuer, but that's quite an experience. I'm actually sad enough to keep a list of what I do shoot, whether that's over in the States, which I try and get over whenever I can. So the current situation, first world problem, of course, but the current situation means I haven't been for over a year. So I am getting withdrawal symptoms there. Trying to think. Well, the highlight that some people who got involved in pre-ordering my book might have seen was we prepared an EM2 for firing, and we put a significant number of rounds through an EM2. That as something that's rare as hell. In terms of firing it, the opportunities are relatively limited, and the historical significance of it. But on my list still to shoot is the 280, because this was a 7.62 gun. So I could go on. The Thompson 1921 model Thompson, one of the first things I was able to shoot. This was a piece that had been used for firing when it was in MOD pattern room hands. So it was again deemed appropriate that we could shoot this. But it's one of two that had Irish provenance. So that one had been kept in running order by swapping parts, so it was a bit less original. But as far as I know, it was still original as to when it came out of terrorist hands some years ago, shall we say. But that, again, an iconic historic piece of not only American history, but world history. So, and that's a funny one in a way, because variants of the Thompson are relatively available over there, of course. Your class 3s are less so, as you say, and a 21 rather than a 28, that's just, that's bucket list stuff. So that was amazing too.
Yeah, and you had mentioned the EM2, which is a nice segue into the next thing I'd like to talk about, which is your forthcoming book from Headstamp Publishing, which is still available for pre-order, that focuses on the concept of Bullpup firearms and their history, covering 119 years in the book, which is quite an accomplishment and quite a feat. But before you can really delve into the content of the book, for those who might not know, can you explain what is a Bullpup firearm?
Yes, this was something that I had to tackle. People who know guns know what a bullpup is almost intuitively at this point. Bits of the gun are behind other bits that they ought not to be, according to some lines of thinking. I'd seen various definitions. Often the magazine's involved in that, because it's obviously where the ammunition is feeding from. So it makes sense that it's a gun that the magazine goes behind the trigger. Well, is it? You've got things like the G11 where the magazine's sticking up the top forwards. So that the magazine was quickly discounted. I ended up going partly because I've done a fair bit of work with Armament Research Services, who have done some great stuff on definitions. I was even more in the mindset of, right, we are gonna nail the definition of what is a bullpup. So hopefully people that see my definition will agree with me. And I don't have it to hand, but it's essentially that the grip is in front of the breech face.
Yeah, and and even though that is the simplest way to explain it, even when you break it down into those simplest of terms, there are some people who still stop and go, wait, what?
I know. And then I've had to try and define around that with a note at the end of the chapter that explains that by grip we mean this, because what you find when you look into this is there are so many marginal designs. A good example of, well, thinking about it, most pistols a lot of self-loading pistols and some revolvers could fall accidentally into the category of bullpup, depending on how you define a firearm. So do you define those out and say shoulder arms? Well, we decided not to. So the problem then becomes, what's the grip? Is it 51% of the contact point of a pistol grip? What about if it's a wrist, like a shotgun grip or a semi-pistol grip? What?
Well, there's only one way to find out, and that'll be once the book comes out and people read it, and then you start getting those emails and letters of people questioning what's going on here, right?
Well, you will find there is a Forgotten Weapons video where Ian asks me this question, and there's a bit more detail there about the argument. I haven't dared go back and look at the comments.
Yeah, and that's just it. Wise to stay away from the comments, right? A wise YouTuber doesn't go looking, trying to pick a fight in the comments.
Yeah, I'm probably wrong, even if I'm right.
Yeah, and that's just it. There is always someone behind a keyboard who's willing to argue, no matter how many concessions you make, given one way or the other. You can't please everyone. One person a day. Today is not your day, and tomorrow doesn't look good either, right? Now let's talk about the concept of a book about bullpup firearms. It's quite the departure from your previous book, that focused on the broom handle Mauser. And we're looking at, just one type of firearm, and it's, and it's a very well-known type of firearm. And then we're going into a broad, more than century of history of a type of firearm as opposed to just one individual gun, and a type of firearm that by many people isn't nearly as well known. So I'm curious, what was the impetus behind choosing bullpup firearms as the topic for this book?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I've been quite reactive in my career so far, partly because doing the museum day job doesn't always leave that much time for research, and so a lot of that ends up getting in spare time, and you often don't come up for air to kind of plan what you might want to research into. And in museums, it's often driven by exhibitions and displays, inquiries that you're trying to help with, that kind of thing. But I quite enjoy that, stuff that pops up and then you run with it and you go down the rabbit hole. So in this case, I've mentioned Ares and Forgotten Weapons, and it was a collaboration between those two to create a series of videos on the EM1s, the EM2, the SA80 series back in 2017 that prompted this, because I was asked to produce a series of accompanying blogs, so for perhaps a deeper dive even than Ian was capable of doing in 20 minutes or whatever. And those went up, but of course, YouTube being YouTube, how many people read the description, never mind click a link through to to a blog post. And as I often do, I kind of went a bit over the top and wrote way more than we planned. And so Nick Jensen-Jones at Ares suggested, and luckily in parallel, that he and Ian and James Rupley were looking at founding this publishing company, Headstamp Publishing. And so that seemed like a good second title. So Ian's Chassepot to FAMAS book would come out first, and did I want to do the second one in the series? And of course, yes, I did. So starting from, I think it was 37,000 words, compiling the blog posts just as a starting point, I am now at, so it'll be, I think I'm right in saying about 180,000 words and like 600 pages currently. I'm fully expecting to be edited at any point, but at the moment we're nearly at the end of the process, and I seem to have sneaked through with something that you could, probably prop up the corner of your house with. So,
And I think most people who are in the market for your book, are really interested in that deep dive that they can take into the concept. And whether it's your book or it's Ian's Chasseau de Famas or it's anything that collector grade publications or Mowbray Publishing had come out with, we really want that book that is kind of a one-stop shop of all the information you could ever want. I'd much rather be in a situation where I'm going, my gosh, my eyes are glazing over. I've got to step back. This is kind of an information overload, instead of finding myself going, well, this didn't answer my question. In fact, now I've got more questions, and now I got to go look for another book and another source because this didn't help. Not to say that I don't like having an excuse to buy more books. More is always better. But there is something to say for having an authoritative and definitive volume, such as what you're hoping to put out. And really looking forward to reading the book when it comes out. I know at the time of this recording, it's still in the publication process. But do you guys have a time frame for the release date for the book yet?
Yeah, I think the Kickstarter official delivery date is February, I believe.
Okay, February 2021. Well, that's not too far off here for those who are listening around the time when this is recorded. But at any rate, it'll certainly be worth the wait, that's for sure. As we wrap up the interview here, I want to ask you a question that is by far the most important question that we will touch on in this entire interview. And that is, if you could meet any firearms designer, living or dead, who would it be and why?
Oh, there are a few. And I think I'm going to go with something a little more antique, because I've spoken a lot about more modern stuff. But what name that first came to mind, firstly, was Ezekiel Baker, who, of course, celebrated for the rifle that ended up with his name, even though that wasn't the official name. And one of the things I grew up loving and helped get me into this world were the Sean Bean Sharp movies, effectively TV movies. And so I knew what a Baker rifle was. Well, probably before that, to be fair, but it was the unsung hero of that, and the more, and I've never done any formal research into Baker, but maybe that's why I would particularly like to just meet him over a flagon of something and hear what he had to say. I mean, luckily you can read his book on the rifle and his thoughts on what makes a suitable rifle for primarily for military purposes, but also for the civilian, because he was one of these sort of gentleman designers that we celebrate from the late 19th and early 20th century. But he was doing it end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th, and was involved in much more than just the Baker rifle. He was prior to Lovell, who developed the British percussion series of arms that succeeded it. Baker was involved in some really important general issue weapons, not because, of course, the Baker rifle was a specialist weapon, essentially. So he'd be very interesting, I'm sure. And he has one of the coolest names in firearms history, I think. And I probably have to, if I can throw in a bonus, I'd probably have to throw in my namesake, Patrick Ferguson, who people often say, any relation? No, sadly not. But we have one of his rifles in the collection. It's on display at Leeds, and he's a fascinating character. And of course, because I love the States and I'm British, it's a nice connection between the two countries. Albeit it's in the context of warfare between the two nations, effectively.
I love both of those answers, and choosing a couple more obscure designers is the sign of someone who really enjoys researching and diving deep and exploring the more obscure names. Because the very easy answer to that, would have been something like John Moses Browning or Sam Colt. But instead, going a bit more obscure, I think that's great. Those are both fantastic answers. I mean, and I'd love to meet Ferguson and Baker myself. And of course, I'd also like to meet Colt and Browning too, but solid choices all, most definitely.
I think we need an honorable mention for Sir Hiram Maxim as well, because you mentioned Colt, and of course I'd be in the queue to meet all of these guys, and Stoner and Kalashnikov, and I've been fortunate to meet a couple of designers, but the ones that are on at the top of everyone's list, they've passed away too soon for that to be a realistic prospect. I know guys that meet Kalashnikov, who met Stoner, but yeah. So if we're shooting for the moon, then you mentioned Colt. He's of course a fascinating character, and he bridges the Atlantic as well with the factory in London, and that wonderful set I think I showed at the symposium of presentation 61 navies that he gave to Mark Firth at Sheffield, that we have which have gone on display now, I'm pleased to say, finally, which is really cool. So Colt would be on there as well, but he of course was a big showman and a marketeer as much as arguably even more than he was a designer. He had a lot of talented people working for him, and I think the situation is probably the same with Maxim, and I'd probably get thrown out of the house for asking searching questions about, who did the actual design work on this.
Yeah, I think it would depend on how many drinks deep we were. I mean, because let's be honest, if we're having dinner with these guys, we're also going to be having a few drinks with these guys, and depending on how loose everyone's feeling, it might determine whether or not we get an answer or if we get booted out the door. All right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap up, discussing who we would love to meet, and then the possibility of insulting a fantastic designer. I think that's a great place for us to stop. Let's quit while we're ahead, right? So, Jonathan, I really appreciate you coming on the High Caliber History podcast. Appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us here and chat with us about some really cool stuff. Hopefully we can have you back. But again, it was an absolute pleasure to have you here. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. Absolute pleasure.
If you're curious to know more about the Royal Armouries, you can visit them online at royalarmouries.org. But remember, they are British, so Armouries has a U in it. I will put a link to the website below. There will also be links to their social media accounts and links to how you can help support the organization, because like everything during COVID, the museum was shut down and they were hurting, so they would appreciate the extra support. So I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. I appreciate you tuning in. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. Leave a comment, leave a rating, give us a review, and share it with someone who you think might like it. Again, I really appreciate you tuning in to this episode with Jonathan Ferguson. That's all for now. I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you again real soon.